afternoon, and welcome to our very first Consider the Sources live stream program, where each month we will introduce you to experts making discoveries about the past, share ingenious methods of preserving and presenting what we've learned, and give you a peek at parts of Colonial Williamsburg rarely seen during a typical visit. I'm your host, Stacy Loveland, and today we are coming to you live from our Textile lab to talk all about dressing a mannequin for an exhibition. We'll be taking your questions a little later in the program, so please post them in the chat or the comments. Before we get to those, though, I'd like to introduce our special guests. With me today are Gretchen, Jackie, and Neal. Gretchen and Jackie, you are both textile conservators, so why don't you tell us each a little bit about your background?
Thanks. My name is Gretchen, and I hold a graduate degree in art conservation from the Winterthur University of Delaware program in art conservation.
Wonderful. Happy you're here with us today.
Thank you.
And Jackie?
I am also a graduate of the Winterthur University of Delaware program in art conservation with specializations in textile conservation and preventive conservation, and I've been with the foundation for about 3 years.
Wonderful. And Neal, your job is a little bit different. You are a textile curator. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your background as well?
Sure. My background's a little bit different, as I actually have been here at the foundation sort of in 2 different stints. I initially was here and worked in the trades department as a tailor, and then went and finished my undergraduate degree in history at the College of William & Mary. And then, like my 2 colleagues, also went to the Winterthur program in American Material Culture at the University of Delaware before I came back to Colonial Williamsburg.
Excellent. Well, I'm thrilled you're all here with us today. I think we're going to have a lot of fun. We are right now here in the Textile Lab. So let's just start out by learning a bit about what textile conservation is and what happens here in the lab.
My name is Jacquelyn Peterson-Grace, and I am the Assistant Conservator of Textiles here at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Conservation is what we focus on here at the foundation. As conservators, we are primarily concerned with the long-term preservation of our collection. And so all of the actions that we do, from the way that we store our collections to the actual conservation treatment that we do, focuses on how we can make these objects last for as long as possible. Conservation can be things like the way that we store our collections, keeping them away from high humidity and keeping the temperature regular, as well as using inert materials, as well as structural intervention, things like addressing structural weaknesses like holes or losses, all the way into something like wet cleaning, where we are primarily focusing on trying to remove harmful materials like degradation products. So there's quite a range that conservation encompasses. The goal of restoration is often more to improve the aesthetic appearance of an object and bring it back closer to the way it looked originally, with less of a focus on long-term preservation. So sometimes there's some overlap between conservation and restoration, but again, here at Colonial Williamsburg, we focus primarily on keeping these objects and preserving them for future generations.
Hello, my name is Gretchen Guidess, and I'm a textile conservator here at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. We have some critical pieces of equipment that aid us in doing conservation treatment here in the lab. The first is our photo studio setup, which aids us in the documentation of our various textile projects. We can take very good documentation photographs of the before, during, and after treatment states of our textiles. Another dedicated space is the dye lab, which allows us to custom color and color match sheer fabrics that we can use in treatment. We use them as underlays to bridge weak areas, as well as overlays to protect abraded areas. A bonus is that we can then custom dye finished fabrics that we can use on our mounts and our torso mounts to make them integrate with our gallery displays. A third item is our stand microscope, which permits us close looking at our objects. This, we can look into the construction of costume pieces, as well as examine the various ways threads are constructed. This aids us in determining possibly campaigns of either restoration or different renovations that costume pieces have had. A final piece of equipment I wanted to tell you about today is not used in treatment at all. We never bring it near our historic collection, but it's critical for making our repro accessories and components for our mounting process, and that is our sewing machine.
Welcome back. Please remember that we will be taking your questions live, so please post them in the chat or comments and we'll answer them. To get started though, we do already have a couple questions coming in. The first thing we want to hear answered is just what kinds of conservation treatments do garments need? What is the specific issue we're dealing with?
Well, because we want to present our garments in 3 dimensions, one of the first things we do when we're assessing a garment is actually figure out the strength and the intactness of the inside of the garment, which will be in contact with the mannequin. So we're looking at, and sometimes we need to treat the linings to be sure that they're complete and won't be harmed in the dressing of the garment.
I wouldn't have thought of that right away, but that seems very important for sure. Anything else?
Absolutely. Another thing that we see quite frequently with our garments is damage in the underarms from perspiration staining. We know that it's something that we all do, and perspiration over time can lead to great fragility in those areas. So we spend a lot of time stabilizing those underarm areas before we can put things safely on a mannequin form.
Makes sense. When I think of perspiration issues, I think of like the staining, and that makes me think of color correction. And Susie has asked a question that clearly is thinking about the same thing I'm thinking about. If you need to use dyes to correct things in the dye lab, do you use natural dyes, or how are you color correcting when necessary?
So if we were to dye some fabric to color match an area of loss, then we would use probably man-made pre-metallized dyes in that case. What we're looking at for our treatment materials are things that are going to have very good longevity and have good light fastness. So our natural dyes, although they're lovely and beautiful, don't often have those attributes associated with them.
That makes sense. Well, this sounds like a pretty interesting, I think, career path to have. I'd be interested to do this, and I think a lot of people out there are wondering too. You talked a little bit about your backgrounds, but how do you actually become a conservator? We know you went to Winter, but what else is involved?
So before graduate school, conservators will study chemistry, art history, and studio arts. And all 3 of those things are equally important in approaching an object and in the work that we do in general. So that is both undergraduate classes, and then we also do a series of pre-graduate program internships to get a sense of what the field actually entails, what the day-to-day work is. And then usually, we'll go to graduate school, and then postgraduate fellowships usually occur after the graduate degree.
It's a lot of work, but clearly very much worth it.
Absolutely.
Excellent. And for people who want to become a conservator or who are interested in learning more, where can they go to find information about how to do that?
Well, there is a professional membership organization that quite a few of us belong to, and that's called the American Institute for Conservation. And in that, they have a specialty group that is absolutely targeted for finding out about the field and maybe starting your pathway on that career
Wonderful.
thing. And they have a specialized group called the Emerging Conservators Professional Network. And they also have a Facebook presence, so look for them there.
Excellent. So if this sounds like something you want to do, you should check that out. Sounds really promising. Teresa has asked, how has sewing needle size changed, and how does that affect working with fabric? As obviously these are hand sewn, people are sewing by hand. How are changes in all that changing what you have to do?
Well, needle size has changed quite a bit over, if we're looking at in terms of the historic needles themselves. Generally speaking, needles in the period were drawn wire, and so they were drawn out, sharpened, and then packaged and shipped all over the world. Whitechapel was an area in England that was known for its needle manufacturing. So today we have various different qualities, some not so great, some better than others. But I'm not sure what you guys end up using, Gretchen and Jackie, for your work compared to, let's say, somebody who's reproducing these garments, or somebody who in the 18th century was having to sew these garments that you see all around us here. Generally speaking, I think that you're probably going to find more sizes and variety of needles in the 18th century because people are sewing by hand on a regular basis than probably what you find today, quite honestly. But what about you guys? What kind of needles do you guys end up using?
So our considerations are different than the making of a garment, and much of what we're selecting for is to not show or damage the fabric that we're sewing into. So we're picking the finest needles that we can find, and oftentimes we find beading needles to be that fine, because unlike our predecessors, we don't want to disturb the weave structure at all. And in point of fact, there's frequently renovations that happen with these garments, and that needle scarring is actually good evidence for someone like Neal or myself or Jackie to really consider what has happened to a garment over time.
Wow, that's fascinating. Such a small thing as the needle being used can really leave that trace. That's incredible to be able to track from a historian standpoint. Great question, Teresa. Thanks. Beth is asking, what has been the most rewarding or interesting conservation project you've each worked on? Anything that springs to mind?
Oh, that's such a difficult question. I mean, we spend so much time with these objects that even if something comes across your table that you don't necessarily identify with or, connect with on a personal level, by the time you've done all of your examination and your many hours of treatment, you kind of fall in love with everything. So, I mean, I think it's hard to choose a favorite.
Yeah, I love the question, but it's like selecting your favorite child, or it's just really tough to select from.
That's completely fair. Neal, do you have anything that's crossed your work table? Put on display that you enjoyed?
Since we're constantly acquiring things for the costume collection, there are some pretty amazing things that we've been able to acquire to preserve for posterity. One thing that springs to mind are these two gowns that we were able to purchase that are made from the same fabric, and they seem to be the same measurement. So the question is, are they sisters? Don't really know the story on them. Sadly, there's nothing that we have that was passed down with these objects. But since about 1790, 1800, these two gowns have lived together. And now we've been able to preserve them still together now for forever. So look for those on our eMuseum website.
That's incredible. That would definitely stand out for me too.
They're very, very neat pieces.
Wow. Well, thank you guys so much for sending in the questions you've already sent. Please keep sending us more questions. We're going to learn just a little bit more about the process of dressing mannequins for display, but we'll keep answering questions when we come back.
It's important to mount costume, particularly to interpret it correctly. Trying to see a garment in the flat, it's very difficult to interpret. How is it worn? Why was it worn in that way? When we appropriately mount the garment, we bring to life the body that once wore it. We have a sense of the mass, the weight, even sometimes the stance of an individual that wore that garment. These mannequins are built specifically for historic dress. That means their hands, their arms, their legs, the way they stand, the width of their shoulders are well suited for historic clothing, as well as 18th and 19th century notions of etiquette and deportment of the physical form.
So the first thing that we have to do with these mannequins is create essentially a t-shirt, a cotton knit t-shirt that we can, it's very form-fitting, it's very tight, so it's all going to stay in place if the mannequin has to be moved from one building to another, as it does here. And then from there, we're using the garment's measurements and trying to translate those into what the mannequin looks like. And so we're using layers and layers of polyester batting, occasionally a polyester felt. Both of these are totally inert. They don't have any adhesives or additives, which we love. And we are carefully, essentially sculpting these forms building out one layer at a time. And when we use this polyester batting, we are, rather than cutting it and creating blunt edges, we're kind of tearing and feathering each of these layers so that they smooth and create really a kind of a sculpted form. So no mannequin can kind of be translated for another garment after it's been built up for a specific piece. We are using a material called false shape that we have borrowed from the theater industry. We can cut and stitch it as we would a fabric, and then put it over a three-dimensional form, like a torso mannequin form. And then using steam, or a combination of heat and pressure, the material will shrink by about 15 to 30% and harden over the form that you put it over. And so in this way, we can make dozens of false-shaped torsos from our single mannequin torso. And then we can stitch into this false shape once it's hardened, cover it with a show fabric, and then the garments get mounted in the same way using the same process as with a mannequin.
Welcome back. Let's go live with some questions about this process. Right off the bat, what are the challenges of working with mannequins?
Well, mannequins are certainly one of the biggest challenges, and I think Jackie and Gretchen and I probably talk about mannequins every single day that we work together. As you can see behind us in some of the dress mannequins here, they are a unique style. It's a style that we have been using here for quite some time, but it also shows our bias in our collection and what does actually survive from the 18th century, which is mostly higher end objects from the period. So they are a constant challenge that we work with, particularly trying to achieve the shape and size that we're always trying to gain with the objects that we're putting on them. Here at Colonial Williamsburg, we're very fortunate that we have a huge range in sizes and shapes of our garments. I know there's sort of, again, this old adage that clothing and people were smaller back then, but if we look at our collection, in fact, it really would prove it wrong. We have all shapes and sizes from tall to small, everything in between. It's quite amazing what we do have in our collection. But then that also has to be reflected by the mannequins we use. And thankfully, Jackie and Gretchen have done a great job in trying to make these mannequins that we currently use work for us very well.
Thank you. Marjorie has written in asking, are your display mannequins custom made? They appear to have different shapes and proportions, as you mentioned, compared to contemporary mannequins. And I know we just saw a video of how you pad things out, make it to fit, but there's other mannequins present too, other than just the torso we saw you shaping. So can you talk a little bit more about those mannequins and where we're getting them from?
Sure. The mannequins, the female mannequins you see around us here are coming from a company in Japan that is producing them for museums. And what's unique about them, unlike, let's say, a traditional store-bought mannequin for, a large store that would be displaying clothing on them, is the fact that the torso is in the shape that was fashionable for that period. So we're not actually having to take, let's say, for an 18th century gown, a pair of stays to create the shape that was fashionable for that period. The body, the torso of the mannequin underneath of it is already in that shape. But we do have to, in many cases, continue to alter that. And that's what Jackie and Gretchen do to make the garments fit very well. So in this case, the mannequins do come in a couple different sizes, and we're able to then scale them up if necessary. Can't scale them really down, but we can make them larger if we need to.
Awesome. How long does it take to prepare an exhibition? So I mean, there's a lot of work that goes into creating the mannequins, making sure everything is padded out properly, getting the garments themselves ready, and then dressing the mannequins. How long does that take? How long does it take to do a single mannequin, a torso, a whole exhibition? What are we looking at?
Well, the whole process starts with Neal kind of, giving us this object list, right?
Yep, exactly.
And then once we do have those objects identified, we need to, of course, take a close look at them, do an overall survey, which takes time, and then the conservation hours can vary from garment to garment, depending on, it could be, 3 hours, or it could be 50 or 60 or 100 hours for a treatment. And then the actual mannequin dressing, we usually budget about a week per mannequin, and the same with these torso mounts.
Wow, that's That's pretty impressive, but certainly well worth all the effort. And as we're talking about what we see here, what can you tell us about the garments behind you? I know I've spent a lot of time looking at them. Is there anything in particular you want to share about what we're seeing here?
Well, what we're working on right now is preparing for our first costume show in the new costume gallery. So Colonial Williamsburg will be opening a dedicated gallery to costume. And the show itself will be on a single collector, a woman by the name of Mary Deering, who started collecting in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and has amassed a magnificent collection of objects dating from as early as about 1650 through about 1840. And so we're going to take you through her collecting experience. And some of those things, like you see behind us here, all these waistcoats, for example, are a signature of her collection. She had collected over 100 waistcoats when she was readily and actively collecting. And all the other garments you see here as well is just great examples of pieces from her collection. Again, that will sort of lead you through how she collected things and why she collected things, and sort of her educational love of using these things using these garments for teaching, particularly in the classroom. So that's what we're preparing for, hopefully to open sometime next year. So we're working pretty ahead of schedule right now, which is great.
Excellent. Well, if y'all like this preview, come back in a year and see it in person. I can tell you it's spectacular already.
The show will be up for 3 years, and there'll be 3 rotations of the show. So so about over those 3 years, there'll be 150 objects that will get rotated in and out of the show. So yeah.
Wonderful. That's very exciting. Lots for you guys to do too.
That's right.
Doug is asking, when we look at the mannequins and all the work you do to make sure the clothing is preserved, are the mannequins being moved fully clothed, or does that depend on the garment and how fragile it is and other factors going with that? We see them dressed here. Do they stay dressed?
Well, for right now, where we prepare everything and document it and get it ready is some distance from the actual exhibition site. And so that has always been our hurdle. It is a hope that one day we will be able to have a modified transportation so that they would be semi-dressed or semi-prepared to move out. Things like the torso mounts can, because they're a bit easier to maneuver and protect, can move fully dressed. So it's a combination of some undressing that happens for the transport and then redressing on site.
That makes complete sense. Howard is asking, were the stitches used in the 18th century different than those that are being used today? Is that a challenge you have to overcome when looking at and preserving these?
Well, what's interesting is, so we're looking at original garments. So everything you all see here behind us and surrounding us are pieces that date prior to 1840, so prior to the invention of the sewing machine. And so there are definitely some stitches that are in the historic garments, let's say, that are different than what we might use today for assembling some sections. A lot of this has to do with the order of assembly. Most of us know how things are put together today thanks to sewing machines, which is quite backwards compared to how somebody was putting it together by hand. But I know that just by talking with Jackie and Gretchen, there's quite a few different stitches that you all use when you're dealing with certain areas and certain treatments that you're working on.
Well, in large part, conservation stitching is quite different than any of the construction stitching or approaches that you would encounter. So what we're trying to do is actually minimize our stitching when we do it because of asking the garment or the textile to do much to carry the support. So, there is sort of a handbook of stitches that we employ, but they are uncommon to what you would normally encounter with like running back stitches or basting stitches that you would have used in the construction of the garment.
I never would have considered that, but that makes so much sense. Of course. Well, going along with stitches, the other part of that is what you're sewing into. And Teresa is asking us about fabric in the 18th century. Thank you for this question, Teresa. I love talking about fabric. She wants to know, what was the most popular type of fabric in the 18th century and were combination fabrics used back then as well. And I'm going to add, how do you deal with all these different types of fabrics coming across your table? Are they treated differently or the same?
Yeah, there's a huge amount of fabric that was available in the 18th century. Prior to the outbreak of the American Revolution, the vast majority of the fabrics that we use here in North America are imported from England. We're really not producing, we are producing fabric here, but not as an industry like you're going to find in England. The textile economy is the biggest in England itself. It's a powerhouse of an industry. So linen, cotton, wool, silk, hemp, leather, furs are all used when constructing clothing in the period. And certainly fabrics that have blends, whether they were blended together when they were spun or whether they were woven together with using different fibers, were certainly being used. And linsey woolsey is probably a great example where you have a linen warp that's being filled with wool. And I think we probably see all of these pretty regularly coming through the lab here, and in our extant garments as well. Probably the most common combination fabric that we see is in linings. That's a linen and cotton blend that's oftentimes referred to as fustian. We see it fairly regularly, coming through, in the period garments that go through the lab here.
Excellent. Does that present any challenges handling that, having combinations come across, or just different types that are more difficult to work with?
So our approaches are really tailored to how it ages over time and how what inherent problems arise because of that. So I would say Jackie has been tangling with some silks that have predominantly split in some cases because of this, not necessarily blending, but just the types of finishes and things that have happened over time in the processing of that textile before it was made in a garment.
So everything's really case by case.
Absolutely.
You guys.
Absolutely.
Oh, it's great you can give everything such specialized care and treatment then. Another very specialized aspect, something else that is kind of a case-by-case basis, is something Mary is asking about. Thank you for your question, Mary. Mary says many high-end garments have metal embroidery. I think we have some even behind us today. How do you deal with metallic embroidery, as metal is also aging differently than fabric?
Absolutely. That's something that we've been coming across a lot recently. And yes, some of these waistcoats behind us have some beautiful metal embellishments. The first thing is that we always handle those kinds of garments with gloves. We know that the oils in our fingers impact metals a lot more dramatically than textiles, and so we're very careful with our handling. As far as, you think of silver and you think of tarnish, and the way that these metal wrapped threads were created, the silver layer is so thin that we don't have the option of polishing like they would for a silver, object. So we kind of have had to learn to live with the tarnish. There just isn't much that we can do about that, except know that, this original object's appearance would have been so much different.
Wow, I never even considered trying to polish embroidery. That's really a lot to handle. So far we've talked a lot about things that are very visible on the outside of the garments, but Deedle has written in asking about the inside of a garment. Are we seeing selvages and interior edges being finished when we look inside, and is that something you guys deal with too?
Yeah, it depends on the garment, and it depends on the fabric, because they definitely do treat each fabric differently. So if something is unlined, then we oftentimes do get a good shot of the selvage. And selvages can be helpful in identifying where some of these materials came from. Some things aren't nearly as finished as perhaps we would like in the 21st century. And some that's because of the processing of the material. In front of us here, this red waistcoat, sort of cranberry colored waistcoat, it's made from a material called broadcloth, which is a heavily fulled wool. And so when that edge is cut, when the tailor is making the cut into that, it is never going to be turned and finished as we'd expect for let's say a really heavy wool modern coat, because they realize the quality of the wool can hold that raw edge. So it really does depend on the material and the garment that it's being made into. So the tailor, who would have been apprenticed for many years, would have had a good forethought in terms of how this garment would have been finished when they were making it for the customer.
Probably one of my least favorite things about modern fabrics is how often I have to finish edges when I sew modern clothing for myself. So it's definitely refreshing to hear about that for sure. Thank you all so much for the questions you've sent in so far. We're going to keep taking more in a moment, but we also have a video from Neal in Costume and Textile Storage where you'll get to see some of our collection and hear about what we can learn from it.
My name is Neal Hurst. I'm the Associate Curator of Costume and Textiles at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Today we are sitting in the storage facility for all of Colonial Williamsburg's costumes and textiles. The Colonial Williamsburg Foundation has a collecting policy for the decorative arts, and it allows us to collect up to 1840. Now, we do have many objects that date prior to that, and some things that are in fact very, very early. Our earliest piece dating probably to about 1560 is a black work cap and forehead cloth. My job as a curator here at Colonial Williamsburg is really multifaceted. I work on many different projects, including exhibitions, working with the conservation team to prepare objects to go on view, working with colleagues in the historic area, working with scholars who come here to visit and study the antique objects to gain a better knowledge of the antique pieces. I work with the Costume Design Center, those who are constructing the costumes that are going out to the historic area, studying the antiques here to use as examples for the patterns they're actually creating for all the garments they actually make. When planning an exhibition, my philosophy is really always to choose the best objects that are going to tell the story that we are trying to tell. Some objects have no history to them, some have incredible histories to them, but whatever those histories may be, they need to be engaging so that individuals coming to read the exhibition are going to engage with it and understanding. Dress is one of the few things that people can really relate to today in the 21st century, as we still wear clothes on a daily basis today. Other than looking at antique garments, there are many ways that we can sort of delve into learning about what our ancestors some 200, 300 years ago actually wore. One medium would be looking at portraiture, which is we have a great collection of portraits here at Colonial Williamsburg that we can look at in order to gain a good understanding of what people here in Virginia were wearing on a daily basis. We also have written records, things like wills and probate inventories that we can delve into in order to gain a better understanding of what people wore and owned at certain times in their lives. Newspapers also add a very good and sometimes complex understanding of what individuals were wearing through things like runaway ads or even advertisements for stolen garments. So many, many different things we can look at in order to get a better idea of what individuals were wearing in the 18th century. So my role in dressing a mannequin for exhibition really starts when I select the object that is going to go on view. The object is then brought to the lab where Gretchen will have a look over it and then begin the conservation work. She's really going to do the bulk of the work in terms of readying the mannequin to actually fit, the garment to fit on the mannequin itself. Once we actually start doing the fitting, we have to sometimes mitigate some problems where we may not have a petticoat or a pair of breeches or a waistcoat that survives with the garment that's going on view. So we may have to call upon our historic area friends to actually make reproductions for us, whether it may be a pair of breeches or a petticoat. Once we begin the dressing process, Gretchen will do most of the mounting on the garment, but things like accessories I'll help choose, such as jewelry. The last thing that we're doing is looking at portraits and prints and other sources to make sure that the gown is meeting the fashion that it's actually supposed to be in. Underwear is really important in order to get the right silhouette that these garments would have had when they were being worn by individuals some 200 years ago. Women in the 18th century are primarily wearing stays, which is the upper body garment that's going to support the bust and the back. And then depending on the time period, early in the century, women are wearing what's known as hoops, which give fashionable width going out to the side of the gown. Now, as the century comes to a close, the hoops tend to start to collapse and they get smaller and smaller. And in fact, most of the garment then gets pushed out to the back side of the lady. They begin wearing what's referred to as false rumps or cork rumps, basically all the fullness pushed out. We may refer to that today by a later 19th century term as a bustle.
But we are able to replicate these things not by using antiques, but by using different means that Gretchen and the conservation team are able to fabricate and then use underneath the garment. And this is sort of twofold. One, it's going to protect the antique garments, making sure that we're not putting any undue wear on them. And two, it also protects the garment itself. So that way we can take preventive measures, making sure that we're not putting anything that's going to abrade the garment or hurt the garment, the antique garment, over top of it. Because all these things are sort of buried under the layers of the gown itself. Men's underwear is a little less structured than the women's counterpart that when we dress. In fact, men in the 18th century sort of had the option to wear underdrawers if they wanted to. They are being made, we could document them, they survive, but it tends to be more of an option compared to how we think of underwear for the modern man today. But generally speaking, men are wearing a shirt, which is a very large, rectangular, geometrically cut garment that's going to reach all the way down to about their knee or even below their knee in many cases. But then that gets tucked in and around the breeches itself. So here we run into a problem when we start dressing our mannequins, because we don't want to put any undue stress on a pair of breeches, let's say, that is 250 years old. So we don't really want all of that bulk in there. So one thing you'll find with our mannequins is that we tend to do sort of what we call dickies, these sort of cut off shirts that are just the upper part or just the lower part of the sleeve, so that way we're not actually putting all of this fullness in and around the garment when we're actually dressing it. One of the unique things that we have here at Colonial Williamsburg is the ability to work with our historic tradesmen in the historic trades department. There, the needle trades, such as the tailors, the mantua makers, the wig makers, even the shoemakers, come and work with me here in the collections department to study antiques that are actually here in our collection. So they're able to draw patterns off of them, study them, look at how they're constructed, document those things, and then take them back to the trade shops where they're able to reconstruct garments. From there, they have individuals they're making clothing for, and they're able to then make the garments and see how they fit, how they wear, what their comfort level is, and really being able to take this from looking at the antiques to a full reproduction in one location. One of the places that individuals can go, even when an exhibition is closed, is to our e-museum website at Colonial Williamsburg, as we chronicle all of our exhibitions through that website. And the e-museum is a really unique place because as we get new objects in the collection or as we find new information, that site is constantly updated with new photography, new information all the time. It is a living and breathing section of our collections area here at Colonial Williamsburg. So always go back and check, take a look at the new objects that are showing up. Lots and lots of information is constantly being published on there, especially for the costume and textile sections.
Those are some very exciting clothes to get to see. Keep sending in your questions about textile conservation, dressing mannequins, and our textile collection. We're going to keep answering them. We do already have a few new questions, starting with one from Cheryl. Cheryl says, I imagine there are garments that can't be conserved. What happens to them?
They can be preserved, they can be protected, and they can be studied, which Neal specifically.
Yeah, we have a great collection, albeit small, of objects that may never see the light of day in terms of exhibition. But because we have the Historic Trades program here at Colonial Williamsburg, it offers an opportunity for the mantua makers and the tailors, shoemakers, wig makers to come and actually study the object and actually sort of get inside of it so they can then better replicate those items in the historic area.
That's wonderful. Even if it can't be displayed, we can still show it to everyone and learn from it. That's
Absolutely.
Great. I know Dominica has written in with a question asking about how you replicate stitches and how it works having the garments made by hand. And I know we already talked a little bit about the differences in having conservation stitches versus the 18th century stitches, but are there times when you truly are going to be replicating the stitches that you see? Does that ever pop up?
I think less so in our conservation treatments. We wouldn't do that on an actual object because we do have so many scholars looking at our objects all the time. We want to make sure that our interventions are readily visible in comparison to the original stitching. We do replicate those kinds of stitches when we make reproduction garments, or like Neal talked about with the dickies and things. We want those to look as accurate as possible.
Well, that makes sense. Thank you. Cheryl is asking about cotton specifically. We were talking about fabric earlier, and Cheryl points out, wasn't cotton usually expensive? If it's more expensive, why would it go into blends instead of just linen?
Well, it's all varieties, and fashion does drive this a little bit. Starting in the 1750s, there is a huge rage for printed materials, block printing, and then later roller printing and other methods of printing. And fashion really drives that. People want printed cottons. And a lot of that is also the fact that it's much more serviceable. It's easier to clean, as we see that much of our clothing today is made from cotton. So it can be a little bit of a misnomer that cotton, just sort of blanketing saying that every cotton is expensive. There are cheap cottons and there are really expensive cottons, and there is everything in between. Just like with prints, if we talk about cotton prints, there are really expensive cotton prints which have multiple colors into them. But as soon as the fashion for those falls or the next season passes, oftentimes those prints can't be sold, and so they then turn into the cheaper things. So it's amazing, but we're only a ship's passing for fashion between us and England in the 18th century, and it's very seasonal. Fashion is just like it is today in the 21st century.
It's wonderful to see that parallel.
Absolutely.
Susie is asking us about laundering garments. Specifically, Susie's asking, in your research, have you found any information about how garments would have been washed in the 18th century?
In the 18th century, yeah, sure. There's things like your linens, the things that are worn closest to the body, can be laundered and scoured and cleaned, oftentimes being boiled in pots with soaps and bluings, because keep in mind, most of these undergarments are white, and so it's fairly easy to kind of maintain them. Now, when we start getting into your upper body garments, coats and gowns and such, some of them may be cleaned, particularly if you're living in large cities, by dry scourers. So effectively a dry cleaner who's removing spots and stains with alcohol and various other things. There's whole books in the 18th century that are written on in sort of books with recipes in them in order to take these spots out. So certainly, there's professionals here in the city too that you could have your laundry done by. And some of the large households, like the Randolph, the Wythe, the Palace, they have entire buildings dedicated to laundry. So certainly, lots and lots of laundry being done.
And I'm going to add on a question just very briefly. Do any of the things used, any of the chemicals or formulas used in laundering clothes in the 18th century impact the conservation work you're still doing today? Do you find any remnants of that hanging around you have to watch for, or is it mostly neutralized by the time it gets to you?
I'm not sure that there are necessarily cleaning products that I can think of off the top of my head, but there are finishes that are imparted to fabrics that definitely survive even today, and we're always so excited when they do. And I'm thinking specifically of materials that impart a glaze to a surface of a textile, or some other embossing technique that has happened. Can you think of anything?
Not necessarily, although I will say we will wet clean objects. It's a weighted decision, but when that does happen, sometimes when we initially wet out, kind of put that object in water, we will get soap and surfactant residues. I mean, it kind of bubbles on its own, and then you can determine that this was likely laundered in the past, perhaps not rinsed super well. So that does happen sometimes.
That's incredible to have that connection to laundry being done 200 plus years ago. That's amazing. Michael is asking, what were the differences between fabrics used in working men's waistcoats and in gentlemen's waistcoats? So we've talked a lot about fabric, but how are we seeing that practically applied?
Yeah, waistcoats tend to be the area where men will dress up if they wish to. They tend to be, as you can see behind us, so many different varieties there. Tend to be the fancier part of things, particularly for English gentlemen. Working class garments tend to be a little bit more plainer, a little bit more serviceable materials. You'll find things like worsteds, plain worsteds, broadcloths like the red one we've been talking about here in front of me being used. But any of those garments as well could be used by a gentleman too. Gentlemen don't necessarily dress to the nines every single day of their lives. There's certainly plenty of good examples, particularly here in Virginia, where they sort of like this neat and plain style, where they're dressing very plainly with very high quality cloth. materials. So it just depends on the person, depends on the occasion, just like when we're deciding when we get dressed, in the morning.
Excellent. Carrie is asking about the garments after they've been mounted, specifically after you have mounted garments for exhibit, but before they go on display, like the ones behind us here, where do you store them? Do you just get to hang out with the mannequins all day as you work, or is there a special space where dressed mannequins go to await being put on exhibit?
Well, we do have textile storage where we hold our collection, and so that is, I think you saw a vista in part of one such space, and we have another dedicated space in another building. But that is really Neal's purview frequently.
Yeah, once they're dressed, we do have a photography that they'll go through. So we will take all these mannequins up to our photo studio and have a new photography shot, which will then go into the e-museum and prepared for perhaps any of the labels that might be used, detailed shots depending on how the show has been designed. But yeah, they will, depending on what they are, if they're bust forms or if they're on mannequins, they'll get loaded up and moved to the exhibition site and then remounted over there.
Awesome. Well, since we're using the 18th century and original garments to inform more about what we're able to reproduce here, where are we getting the hand-spun, hand-dyed, hand-woven materials for the reproductions? Deedles asked us this question.
That's a great question. And so the clothing that's being produced by the Costume Design Center, which is a separate facility than here, obviously, making all the clothing for the historic area, it's not all being produced by hand or hand-spun. There is a very small percentage which our weaving and dyeing trade will provide to the Costume Design Center. But there are thousands of positions that the Costume Design Center has to clothe, and each interpreter, it's not just one garment, but they're getting a wardrobe. There's a half a dozen shirts, there's 6 pairs of breeches, there's 3 coats per man. So there's a huge amount of factory-like production that's going on there. And so the materials that they're using there are similar to 18th century ones, or ones that are good choices to mimic 18th century styles, but they aren't necessarily hand-dyed and hand-spun because of the demand that we have placed on the Costume Design Center for them to produce that much clothing.
Yeah. And for anyone not familiar with how we do things here at Colonial Williamsburg, well, we do have a weaver shop that you can visit and see our weavers actually weaving in the 18th century manner. It's just one shop with a few interpreters doing the 18th century trade on top of researching and interpreting history and sharing it with all of you, which is why we can only provide a small amount of that,
Sure.
all done by hand here in-house. But it is incredible all the different places we're able to pull things from. Now, I know we touched on this a little bit before, but Crystal is asking something I'm sure a bunch of people are wondering by this point. Are there internships in the conservation department?
There are. There are indeed, and also in the curatorial department as well. We host individuals who are interested through, it's not just the textile lab, but there's other labs here in our department, and we are always looking for individuals who have not only a desire to learn more, but to also have demonstrated skills in the area. And personally, I think because there's so many different types of conservation that we have here in this building, I think it is an excellent opportunity for someone who is really close to considering moving into one of these graduate programs. It's really a nice capstone experience.
Yeah, I imagine it would be incredible to be a part of that. Vicki wants to know, and Vicki, I thank you for asking this question, is there anything the public can do to support textile conservation? What can everyone watching at home do to help?
Well, we can certainly, we do, and we enjoy support from our donors and friends for the work we do, not only from the gallery level, but all the way down to aiding and supporting the tools we have here in the lab, as well as all of our initiatives to try to make reproductions throughout here. So there are a variety of ways that you can donate to us. Specifically to the Textile Lab, we have a fund, as well as to the department, and then further to the foundation.
Wonderful, and I know we're certainly appreciative of all of that. Well, it looks like, unfortunately, we are running low on time, so I'm going to wrap us up with just one final question. I want all of you to give us just last thought. Why is the preservation of textiles so important to you? Gretchen, let's start with you.
Well, the preservation, I think, is absolutely key because we can get back to these stories of people, individuals and groups of people throughout history, and it's really that connection with the human story. It's the first item that you come in contact with when you're born, and it's the last when you leave this earth. So textiles are really something we all have in common.
Very well said. Thank you. Jackie, what about for you?
When we look more broadly at our textile collection, we have all of these garments, but we also have things like needlework samplers and quilts, a lot of which we know the makers of. And so these individual objects are, a direct tie to these women whose stories we know through genealogy and all of that research. So preserving their stories, their ancestors are alive, and it's so important to have that connection.
Oh yeah, that's fantastic. And Neal, what about for you?
Well, the textile collection here at Williamsburg and the costume collection is just, a wonderful thing that we've preserved these, objects for so long. It's one of the few things in the decorative arts where I think a lot of folks can really connect to. We still wear clothing. It may not look like this. We may not wear the same style of garment, but the person 200 years ago was certainly wearing it. So it's a lot easier, I think, for guests to connect to a lot of our costume pieces and our textile pieces. As like Gretchen said, we are surrounded by fabric every day of our lives. But it is so unusual that they survive. These have survived 250 years of abuse, pests, bugs, insects. So it's really amazing that we have the opportunity to protect these things and save them for future generations to enjoy them.
Couldn't have said it better. Thank you. I think my favorite thing personally about history is how much we can find connections to the past in our everyday experience, and being surrounded by all of this right now is certainly an incredible part of that experience. So thank you all so much for sharing that with us.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, we are out of time for today. I have to thank all of you, not just our wonderful friends here, but all of you tuning in at home who sent us your questions. Thank you for joining us today for Consider the Sources. We'll be back live on October 22nd for an exploration of iron to learn all about the importance of this material from the perspective of blacksmiths, archaeologists, and conservators. I'd like to thank Gretchen, Jackie, and Neal for their time today, and I'd also like to thank our generous donors. Without them, programs like this and all the activities we discussed today would not be possible. I'm Stacy Loveland, and until the next episode, whenever you're learning about history, always consider the sources.